Today I want to talk to you about government spending and debt. And I think it's actually quite important because as we've seen with Bob's Economic Freedom Index, one of the things that get most countries is government debt. Government spending, actually, the size of government, right? And what debt is basically the difference between how much the government spends and how much it collects in revenue. So I want to show you what government spending looks like in the US. Obviously, you see the last 2 years, a massive increase in spending to respond to the pandemic. I mean, the scale of the response in the US was close to 27% of our GDP. It was enormous. It was $5.2 trillion were spent, literally spent in the course of 2 years. So it's quite enormous. But there's another thing. So around here, right, you can see, I don't know if I can do this. Is there like something? Yeah, you can see here, so nice other financial crisis. But one of the things that you notice, right, is been going up and up and up and up and up and up. The other thing that you notice is like during this time, we've had a lot of government changes, right? Different parties, different president, different Congresses, and it still goes up. So in a way, government spending, this is way too much government spending, but you can argue that for me, everything is too much government spending, but growth in government spending is bipartisan, right? That's one of the things. So this is the difference between revenue, right, and spending. So you see the spending here, and you see the revenue. Overall, you can tell that revenue as a share of GDP has been relatively constant. There's been relatively constant as a share of GDP. I mean, it may have gone down a little bit, but what has really actually gone up the roof and has gone up quite dramatically and has been with rare exceptions, right? Spending has been the problem. Overspending relative to how much revenue we get. That, not surprisingly, translates into a lot of debt, right? Debt is the difference between how much the government spends and how much it collects. And as you can see, so you have this big spike here. That was the Second World War. It's gone down, but ever since it's gone up. And then going forward, is just getting out of control. And one of the things that you can also notice is that each time there's a crisis, there's a big jump in debt. Right. Now, this is the US. It looks really ugly. But this is Israel, right? So this is the US. So you guys are doing better. We're already at 100% of debt to GDP ratio, right? And you guys are lower. You guys are lower right now, but you're getting you're getting in the 100% of GDP debt territory. Is projected. It could be worse, or it could get better, right? Depending on the policies that are implemented. Did you raise your hand? No. Okay. So in a way. Right? Well, your debt troubles are not as big as the US, right? In a way, I think this could be informative for you because you know that in your future there's a lot of debt, right? So again, this is the US, and this is Israel, right? So why is it that I want to talk about debt? Well, because it used to be, at least in the US, I don't know how it is in Israel, that governments and policy people tended to have an understanding that while, having some debt was okay, having enormous amount of debt just was maybe not economically viable, or at the very least, we've always had a conversation, right? And then when we started actually to need more and more government spending because of the emergency in 2010, first there was the 9/11 and 2001. What we started hearing creeping in the conversation, whether through the policy world or through government officials is that actually, deficit doesn't matter, right? Dick Cheney, who was the vice president on Bush, famously said deficit doesn't matter. And then ever since, things have gotten worse. So we need more debt. People don't we need more spending. Politicians don't actually like to pay spending with higher taxes, even if on the left, they're always talking about how much they want to tax the rich. The truth of the matter is that higher taxes is not politically very popular, right? People will say they want high taxes, but not on them, on other people, right? So this is why a lot of governments resort to actually paying a lot of debt with borrowed money. Interestingly enough, intellectuals have been trying to actually write papers about why indeed we shouldn't worry about so much debt, right? And so for a while, what you would hear in the US, and I think you have these arguments in Israel too, is that we actually shouldn't worry about the debt because interest rates are so low, right? I mean, borrowing money costs nothing, really. It costs absolutely nothing, so we should borrow more money. And so there's this new orthodoxy on debt that we've seen creeping up in the last, I'd say, 15 years, right, of intellectuals and economists trying to make the case for why debt really doesn't matter that much. And before we've had inflation, it was actually a very popular thing to say. I'm curious to see how that line of argument is going to be going forward, right? But basically, that theory that we can increase the debt at no cost because interest rates are really low has found three very powerful allies and advocates in the form of economist Olivier Blanchard, who was the head of the IMF, and is a French economist who's worked most of his life in the US, and Jason Furman, who's also a very famous Harvard economist, who's been the head of the Council of Economic Advisor under President Obama, and Larry Summers, who was also in the Council of Economic Advisors. He was a very famous economist. These are remarkably good Keynesian economists, right? They are serious, serious people. And remarkably, in 2019 and 2010, both of them came up, both groups, so Blanchard and then Furman and Summers came up with theories to explain why indeed the debt doesn't matter that much. Why a government can actually increase the debt, so there's a trick here, but increase the debt at really no cost. The important part of this sentence is if the future is like the past. What this means is if interest rates remain low, you can increase the debt basically, and it will have no fiscal cost, right? Furman and Summers say about the same thing. Their argument is slightly different, but it's this idea, right, that you can increase the debt, interest rates are low. In the case of these guys, they add the fact that besides, right, the government is going to invest wisely, which is going to get great return in terms of economic growth, and hence the debt, as long as interest rates are lower than government growth, the debt ratio to GDP is going to get to melt away. And you can see, I mean, if the future is like the past, that past is basically interest rates really actually going down and down and down and down. And I think that in Israel, you've had that case made to you, right? That the debt really doesn't matter because interest rate. The reason why I'm actually mentioning those three guys is because they're big, influential economists, right? And it was very significant that they came up with these papers, which if we hadn't had inflation, would probably be for the next 20 years the most cited paper in policy that they be. We'll see if this is the case, if this continues. There were a lot of issues with their arguments. One of them being that for most of them, what it requires is only a one-time growth in the debt. And in that case, if you have a one-time growth, you have an emergency, you have to invest a lot of money, to spend a lot of money for an emergency. It is true that if then, from then on, you have a balanced primary deficit, right? So it means the deficit minus interest, then your debt to GDP ratio is going to go down. Now, obviously, that does not apply to the US, which is going to run primary deficits of 5% of GDP forever, right? And total deficit is going to get worse. So I want to actually now, the reason why I wanted to start with this is that there are actually a lot of very serious and respected economists that are putting a lot of work into making that case, right? So this is a case that is now, that people like, and it is a case that is defended in academic paper, right? And so I want to give you some arguments and maybe make the case to you for why you actually shouldn't be so careless about spending and about the size of our debt. Especially because, government spending, again, is a big problem for a lot of countries, and it's one of the things that weigh down their economic freedom, right? So I'm going to talk a lot about the debt, but I want to actually say something that is important. What I care about, and what most of us who believe in economic freedom care about, is the size of government. And the size of government, as Milton Friedman has said, is really truly actually truly measured by measuring spending. Spending is what matters. There are two reasons for this. You can pay for spending with higher taxes, which creates a lot of distortions and disincentive to work and all of that stuff. But the truth of the matter is, like, when you pay government spending with borrowed money, effectively what you're doing is you're committing to higher taxes in the future. Ultimately, the way you pay for the spending is not what matters. What matters is the size of the spending itself, right? This is why Bob's Economic Freedom, they measure government spending. And the way that spending is paid for doesn't actually matter. So you need to remember that when people say, well, we can spend and borrow, right, and it has low interest rate, blah, 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 that spending is going to have to be repaid one way or another. It's either taxes today or taxes tomorrow. So this notion that they're really that different is actually not correct. And in fact, I actually think there's an extremely powerful moral argument to be made against deficit spending, precisely because what you're doing is you're spending on yourself, right? And you're basically kicking the can down the road to have future generation paid for spending you're enjoying. Now, you can say, well, government spending, is like investment, and it will actually grow the economy. Well, I wish it were the case, but in a lot of cases, actually, what government does is crowds out private investment and actually slows down the economy, right? There's an enormous literature about, especially when you spend an enormous amount of money during an emergency, right? When you look at what economists call the multiplier of that spending, which is how much economic return do you get for that dollar that is paid? The consensus pretty much is, even though that's not how politicians talk about government spending, about the multiplier, is like it's somewhere between 0.4 and 0.8. So it means you spend $1, which you take from the real economy, right? Either you tax people or you borrow it, so you take it from and the return you get is less than this $1, right? And that is before you take under consideration a lot of the distortions and the taxes, for instance, if you deficit spend, that you're gonna have to pay in the future. Robert Barrow at Harvard has actually looked at what the multiplier is when you actually take into account the future taxes, and that is negative. So basically, it really kind of, it'd be nice to actually believe in the well, I think it's a lot of wishful thinking. And part of it is because politicians don't actually spend money based on sound economic decisions, right? They usually often spend money based on political decision, right? So they're not the soundest way. And especially in time of emergency, economists know that there are a lot of conditions under which you can get a multiplier above 1, right? And very often, these conditions are not respected. So we can talk during the Q&A, what are these conditions, right? It's targeted, timely, and temporary. So we can talk about this. But very often what you see is that the way the money is spent in time of emergency, which in general would be the time where you would get the highest return for government spending, often because of political reason, that's not how the money is spent, right? So that's about on the spending side. So what are the arguments against debt itself? Apart from the moral aspect, which I think is a pretty important one, I think it is an important one. Politicians usually don't really care about this. So the first one is that debt is expensive, right? When you have government debt, basically you borrow money, you have to repay it back with interest, right? So when interest rates are low, yeah, the cost of those interest payments are low. But remember that even low interest rates on a growing amount of debt is still a lot of money. In the US, so our debt is 100% of GDP, right? In the US, the Congressional Budget Office is projected by 2050, right, quite down the road, with very, very minimal increase in interest rates. Interest payment on our debt is going to be 8% of our GDP. 8% of our GDP. That is going to represent 40% of the revenue that the government collects, right? 40% of the tax collected are going to be going to paying for interest payment. And the more you borrow, let's say, so you're going to be facing, when you get to that point, you're going to be facing difficult political choices, right? Either you borrow more money and add to the tab, or you're going to have to cut spending, the kind of things that people like, right? Because I assume in Israel, you're going to want to keep education, you're going to want to keep defense, so it means that a lot of stuff that are not these big, enormous priorities are going to go, are going to have to be cut. It's the same in the US, right? Difficult choices, really difficult. So it's expensive. Even if interest rates are low, the more you have debt, the more interest payment you have to pay, the more difficult political choices you're going to have to make down the road. Debt expansion itself, because you have to increase the borrowing, leads to higher interest rates. There's a huge literature also that is completely ignored, which shows, and since the Great Recession, since basically the last 15 years, we've had something like 32 different academic studies in 15 years measure exactly this, which is basically the impact of higher government debt on economic growth. And looking at cross countries data, right? So it's not specifically for the US. So all of that data, whether it's on the multiplier, whether it's on debt, by the way, applies to you. It's not specific to the US. These are findings and these are things that you can actually repeat because they will apply to Israel too. It slows down economic growth. How? we're not exactly sure. Part of it is crowding out. I've actually really tried to understand what is the mechanism. I mean, for government spending, we understand, right? It takes money out of the economy. For debt, I'm not exactly sure, but it is, and it's a more than, it's a causation. It's like, so you had a question? Yeah.
The $1 million question. During this seminar, we are understanding that the politics took a decision during the history that no, it's not the best for the economy and it's not best for the citizen. How we can change it? I mean, for example, if we have like a big government, so the debt will be much bigger, but no one can solve it. It's happening in Israel, it's happening in America, and happening all over the world. So
it's a very hard question.
As an economics, we can understand why those decisions will take you on the wrong path, but
so I understand. This is the hardest decision. This is the hardest question, right? Yeah. Because the incentives within government are geared towards politicians catering to special interests, as we've seen. Politicians giving voters what they say they want, which is more government spending without taxes, right? So the incentives are such that basically the system on its own moves towards more government spending, right? We know that. Well, there are two things that actually help change direction. The first one is inflation. Inflation has a way of teaching lessons about fiscal sustainability that is, it's horribly painful, but it tends to actually teach important lessons. I don't think it's a coincidence that the U.S. has had, at least attempt at more failed attempt at fiscal responsibility after a massive bout of inflation, why we had Reagan, and then I believe that competition between countries really helped. The competition that existed between the United States and England on taxes, for instance, has been proven to actually really lead to what the people on the left would say a race to the bottom, but what Bob and I would call a race towards freedom, right? It's like if capital is mobile and is trying to escape to places that treat them better, if you have really crappy system, but as it happens, there's a country like the UK that is doing the right thing, you better also lower your tax rates. So, it can happen, but I wish I could tell you that what I do is actually really, extremely helpful in the fight towards better political decision. But all I can tell you that when I was hired at the Cato Institute to work on spending issue in 2001, the federal government was spending $1.8 trillion. It spends over $5 trillion now. So I'm pretty much like the biggest failure you've ever met at my job, right? It's a miracle that I'm still hired, that I'm still employed, right? It is a really hard question. But I do believe that we can make a difference by actually spreading the information, because when a crisis happens, and when governments and politicians have their back against the wall and have to do something, if they have the information, they are more likely, it's not a guarantee, they're more likely to make the right decisions, right? So debt is expensive. It's actually going to trigger even higher interest rates, which make debt even more expensive. And then higher level of debt slows down the economy. Higher level of debt, and that's an important point, makes it harder to respond to emergencies. So what happens during emergency, whether it's coronavirus, September 11th, you have a war, and you need massive amount of spending, right? If you have low level of debt, you have more leg room to spend money, to borrow money, and to act. But there's another thing, is there's also a pretty big literature on the fact that one of those conditions for the multiplier, do you remember we talked about the multiplier, the bang for the buck that you get when you spend $1? That multiplier is higher, likely to be higher, if it is spent in an environment that has low level of debt and has had not a lot of stimulus spending, right? So there are two things that's happened. You have more leg room, right? And depending on the country, like let's not talk about the US, which in theory can always borrow more money, but it's not true for every country. You have more leg room, so actually if you have less debt, you're more likely to be able to borrow without constraint, which you want during an emergency. But on top of that, if you have a low level of debt, when you respond with emergency with government spending, your money is going to go further away, further down the road, and maybe lift the economy more than it would if you're spending that money in a highly indebted economy, right? That's actually, I think, a pretty big deal, right? So to give you an example, during the US, when the US spent the last coronavirus bill relief, it was close to $2 trillion, $1.9 trillion, right? The estimate for the multiplier for that money was roughly 0.2. So it means that for each dollar that they spend, they got a return of 0.2. On top of that, they got a lot of inflation, which sucks. It's like, you know. So I've talked about the fact that high debt leads to higher taxes, right? But the last point I want to actually talk about with you is the fact that high debt makes it harder to address inflation, right? This is important. It's very important in the US. But it is something you might want to keep in mind for Israel in the future. I know that you don't have as much inflation as we do. We have like, what is it? What did John say yesterday? 8.6, yeah. 8.6%, right? So in the US, we have a lot of inflation. We have a lot of debt. As a reminder, the last time the US experienced high inflation in the 70s and the 80s, our debt to GDP number was 25%. It is 100% now. Why is it harder to address debt, to address inflation when you have a lot of debt? Do you have an idea? Anyone? Yeah?
I guess that, as we learned yesterday, you need to higher the interest rate, and when you have high debt, it's more it's costly to higher debt.
Exactly. So there's a moment where the one response, the one tool, the real tool that the Federal Reserve has, which is to raise interest rates, right, has a real financial cost. Even at 25% of GDP, when we have 100% of GDP, it's an enormous financial cost, right? Because the interest on the debt is enormous, right? Now, in the US, we have a problem that I think is pretty unique. The scale of it is pretty unique to the US, is that 30% of our debt has a maturity of 1 year. So it means that every year, the Treasury, without counting all the coupons, right, they have to roll over $6 trillion of debt. It means they have to take that debt, pay back the short-term bond holders, and borrow that money all over again, right? Roughly 65% of our debt has a maturity of less than 4 years. Our median length of debt is 72 months. 72 months. The US debt, an enormous amount of US debt is short-term. So when you have inflation and your one tool is to raise interest rates and you have super short-term debt, what it means is your fiscal cost is going to be felt immediately. raising interest rates always is relatively painful, right? But in the case of the US, it's enormously painful, right? And you can wonder whether maybe that contributes to the Federal Reserve dragging its feet in raising interest rates in the US and addressing the debt. And if not now, whether in the US, it will happen where basically the Federal Reserve is saying, well, if we raise interest rates to control inflation, immediately that leads to a fiscal crisis, right? Again, if in the US we had to do something like Chairman Volcker did in the 80s, right? Raise interest rate to, I think it was 19%. It was painful. It was bad in the 80s, right? And it was a big fiscal shock. But the debt was 25% of GDP, right? Now it's 100%. And as you've seen in this chart, it's heading towards 200% really quickly, right? But again, I want you to keep this in mind when you think about debt and fiscal sustainability in Israel, because you know your government spending is too high. You know the incentive in politics is to accumulate debt because they don't really, I know that the reason why, since you guys have roughly the same debt to GDP ratio, spending to GDP ratio as the US, so you actually are more willing to tax people than we are in the US. But your debt to GDP is going back up, is going up. And these are issues you're going to have to face, right? So if you happen to have inflation, if you've had inflation in the past, remember this, it's harder to respond to emergency and it's really harder to tame inflation. That point about the debt is increasingly paid for by domestic players, not foreigners, that's something that's specifically, I assume specifically US. I don't know if I have a chart. No, I don't have a chart. Are you, like, do you have any questions? Or, yes?
How do you project 200% by 2050?
So it's not, I don't do that. It's like the Congressional Budget Office, which is a body that's independent, bipartisan, that responds to, answers to Congress's question and puts out budget numbers. These are their projections, and they're usually pretty conservative, that basically they don't, because they make a lot of assumptions, right, as you have to do when you make projection. Very often they assume growth rates that are overly optimistic. They assume barely any increase in interest rates. They assume no recession and no emergencies, right? So these are, in my opinion, they're optimistic. We are very optimistic projection. We are very likely to actually hit those higher number unless something radical changes, right? Long before the CBO.
I don't understand how in Israel we go from 75% to 200 in a year.
In what? In 30 years? Well, you borrow more money. So in the US, if you want to know, the driver in the US, the driver of the future debt are 3 programs. Social Security, which is a retirement account, Medicaid, which is the healthcare for poor people, and Medicaid, which is the healthcare for non-poor people. These are the 3 programs that are driving the bulk of our debt. To give you an idea, Medicare, people pay into the system. In the course of their life, they're becoming eligible for Medicare. That's for the non-poor healthcare program. They pay their whole life, their whole working life, right? It's part of a tax called the payroll tax. I mean, the bulk of the payroll tax goes to Social Security, but a small part of this you pay through insurance premium and through that tax, a small part of that tax goes to. You pay roughly through the course of your life $200,000 per person. Per person, the cost of healthcare, basically what the government pays per person, is $500,000. So it means that right there's a deficit on average per person of $300,000. That's for Medicare alone. So basically, these three programs are the driver of our debt, right? And then you have lower demographics, so fewer people paying into the system, all of this. That's where our debt explosion comes from.
Do you think that there should be a zero deficit budget law?
Well, obviously, I would love if we did, but again, how do you get at it, right? I worry about, I don't mind balanced budget amendments. What I worry about is for a balanced budget amendment to really work well, it has to be designed well. I mean, if you have a balanced budget amendment with a lot of rules so that these guys can avoid and evade the system, it's pointless, right? I mean, there are a lot of budget rules that are violated. To give you an idea, there are rules about the budget process in the US, right? About when they're supposed to give their target for spending, when they're supposed to pass their 12 appropriation bills, blah, blah. Do you know how many times they completed the budget on time following the regular budget rules since 1974? Just give me an idea. Give me like a number, throw a number, like 4. 4 times. They actually passed the budget through the regular budget process 4 times since 1970. Those bastards, they can violate the rules without any problem. So I like the idea of a balanced budget amendment, but I kind of don't trust them, right? The other thing is, how do you design a balanced budget amendment properly? If it's a balance, from a libertarian perspective, I don't want my balanced budget to be balanced at like 120% of spending to GDP, and it means like 100%, like where you have, like, let's say you have 40% spending to GDP, and then the tax has to be the same. It is not the world, you can balance the budget by saying, the spending should be 10% of GDP, or it could be 40%, right? So there's just a lot of ways. Studies have been done in the States for what is called tax and expenditure limits, right? The case is very, very clear. So in theory, states can't run deficits. Because they can't borrow money, right? They have to be, in theory, relatively balanced. I mean, they have a lot of gimmicks to go around this, right? They can go into all sorts of debt, but they're not like on budget, blah, 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 blah. The studies that have been done to study which states have the best tax and expenditure limits show that really the design is everything. They literally, something like 60% of the tax expenditure limits that actually leads to more spending and bigger amount of expenditure, and only a few actually really reduce spending and shrinks the size of the state budget, right? So design is everything. The rules, if the rules are badly designed, it's just not gonna work. So, any other questions? Yeah.
Can you clarify the source of the chart you showed earlier about the debt projection for Israel? I mean, where did you take it from?
I think my research assistant got it from like some international organization.
Oh, I see.
So.
No, I was just curious.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, Yeah, I mean, that's he usually is really good. He doesn't go and get data and but you can check it out. What I checked for individual years, it actually kind of it worked right. So your debt to GDP ratio, which has gone down in the last 2 years, which is quite amazing because ours continue to go up, which shows that it's like you've increased spending a lot, but like you've engaged in some sort of fiscal discipline right now, is 68.8% right now, or something like that, right? And if I remember correctly, spending as a share of GDP is 45%. So the last point is a point about fiscal norms. One of the things that erodes the debt is the fact that they used to be these kind of fiscal norms that, at least in the US, governments and politicians kind of abide with. They were not written rules, they were just norms, right, of behavior, which is that if you have an emergency, it's okay to spend a lot of money, right? But there was an implicit understanding that after a crisis, it's basically dessert now, spinach later, right? It's like you go on vacation, you eat a lot, and then you're kind of like me next week, right? You stop eating all the time. And it used to be the case, even under President Obama, which was called a socialist, right, when he came in power, by people were like the sales of the road to serfdom went to the roof when Obama was elected in the US, right? Well, during the financial crisis, they passed a stimulus bill of almost $1 trillion, right? They increased the debt quite dramatically. The Federal Reserve printed a lot of money. But the message was always very clear from Obama. We're spending a lot later, and we're going to do austerity later, right? Austerity. We're going to cut spending later. We're going to reduce the debt later, right? It's like a lot of spending right now because we need it for emergency. This time, to my knowledge, is the first time that there hasn't been any talk in the US. And apparently it's not the case, I think, in Israel. For whatever reason, either you've let your programs expire, the programs that you've put in place during coronavirus, they were temporarily put in place, expire, or your government has intentionally, cut down spending. But in the US, there's no talk of this. In fact, all the Democrats are talking about is adding more and more and more and more spending. They wanted to actually spend $3 trillion on a bill called Build Back Better. And what that bill specifically was doing, apart from doing a lot of the things that the Democrats like and always wanted and blah, 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 is make permanent a lot of these programs that were put in place during coronavirus, make them permanent, right? And so the erosion of fiscal norms, what?
No, nothing.
I can explain.
No, I wanted to know what's the name of the bill?
Build Back Better. Build Back Better. It's dead. Well.
Sorry.
No. So it's called Build Back Better. They always find really sexy name, we're going to build our economy back. It's going to be great. It's another way to say what Trump used to say, make America great again, but it's the Democrats' way, with a lot of green spending and a lot of individual checks and a lot of that stuff, right? So there's a complete erosion of fiscal norms in the US, where no one is talking about austerity. In fact, the last recession, during the last emergency, it was actually quite striking. Immediately in the tail of the Great Recession, we had an enormous national debate about austerity, about how do we reduce the debt to GDP ratio, right? It was on everyone's mind. The US has a system that it hits some debt limit, and then Congress has to authorize Treasury to go above that limit, right? And so the end of the Great Recession, coincide with a discussion over increasing the debt limit, and the Republicans somehow find their spines and were saying we're not going to increase the debt ceiling without some reform to those three programs we were talking about, right? So right now there's an erosion of fiscal norms, which means that basically we can, because it's hard, right? I mean, it is so much easier to just tell people, that's what you want, here it is. And taxes are not popular, as I said, so you can just just put it on Uncle Sam's credit card and just forget about it, right? All kind of pretense of trying to be fiscally responsible is gone. The Republicans are not trying to be fiscally responsible any more than the Democrats. They all want to spend on different type of things, and actually now they want to spend on a lot of the same things. So those norms are gone. So the problem with that, right, apart from kind of, I don't like it, is the fact that the next emergency, right, what it means is that you have this guaranteed trajectory, which we are, where no one ever tries to clean our act and get us on a better path. I wanted to talk a little bit about the risk of fiscal dominance if you have inflation. Yep, go ahead.
Is there any limitation on the government, the U.S. government, in rolling over debt by issuing new bonds, or they can continue?
Well, so there's no internal limit, right? It's all about whether people are willing to buy that debt, right? And one of the theories that people have had the last few years, Ilan and I were talking about this at lunch, and I've always said that I thought it was a very unwise theory, is that there will always be demand for government debt. U.S. government debt is extremely safe. There's no doubt about this, right? But there are people who actually believe that we should never, ever worry about borrowing too much money, precisely because interest rates were so low, because there was this infinite demand for government debt. That government debt, that if the government dumps $2 trillion of bonds, that there will always be people to buy it. Well, I don't believe in, when people say this will never happen, right there, I kind of like, I'm like, I just never really quite believe it. And by the way, with the argument that we should not worry about debt because interest rates would never go up, right? I was kind of, first I was thinking that's a dangerous claim to make, because we've seen a lot of countries where actually they had low interest rates until they didn't. Think about Greece, and I'm not comparing the US to Greece, right? I'm just saying that Greece, during the financial crisis, could borrow at low rates until overnight it couldn't, right? Italy, yeah. And these are kind of more predictable to say, I don't believe it, right? But the other thing is, one of the things that we've learned over the years, and in the 70s and 80s also, is that you should never use long-term interest rates, right, to predict short-term interest rates. So people who say, look, expectations of inflation, and look at interest rates, they're staying low, so it means we're not going to have inflation. People think that the US, like, when you look at what happened in the 70s, what you see is the market actually didn't predict inflation until inflation was already there, right? So you have a spike in inflation, and then you have an increase in expectations, and so I think you have to be very careful about using those long-term interest rates as kind of a comfort blanket to tell yourself it's okay, it's never going to happen. I think it's really dangerous, right? So for all of these reasons, there's another reason, which is Very often the people who were telling us not to worry about borrowing more debt because interest rates were never going to go up are also the same people who were telling us that inflation was a thing of the past. It would never happen. And besides, we should not worry about inflation because if inflation happened, then the Fed had the tool. What is that tool? Again, it's raising interest rates. You can't have it both ways, right? You can't say at the same time, don't worry about inflation because the Fed has the tool, which is raising interest rates, and say, don't worry about the debt because interest rates are always going to stay low. There's so many assumptions, right, that go into this that are just not consistent and extremely risky. And so as such, because we don't know when the next emergency is we know there will be another emergency. We know we're going to need more money. That is not in doubt, right? Whatever the emergency is going to be, either it's going to be a war, it's going to be a pandemic, we didn't see that coming. It's going to be a financial crisis, which actually people saw that coming, but let's say we didn't see it coming, right? We know there's always an emergency in the corner. At the very least, there's always a recession. On average, there's a slowdown of the economy every 10 years, right? On average. Seems to be accelerating, but so it seems to me, if we put it all together, right? If we put it all together, that the wise thing to do, at the very least, is to actually make sure that your fiscal path is sustainable. And one of the ways you measure it is by the level of your debt. Now, the true size of government, as we've said, is spending, right? But at the very least, when you look at your fiscal path, having lower level of debt, right, is basically wiser. It's more prudent for all sorts of reasons. Just to sum it up, right? High debt means slower growth. High debt means during an emergency you have much less room for action. High debt means the bang for the buck that you get for your emergency response is usually very tamed when you have high debt, right? The multiplier is much lower. High debt makes it much harder politically, but also fiscally to respond to high inflation, right? And it's harder to control inflation, right? So I just kind of want to give you, and then we can talk. I don't even know what time it is. Do you know how much more? How long?
In 4 minutes.
I have half an hour. This is good. We're going to have questions. So, and we can go wherever you want. I may not be able to answer, but we can. But the reason why I'm spending so much time on this, and I may sound as if I'm repeating myself and being laborious about this, is the truth of the matter is one of the things that actually that gets in the way, one of the big things that gets in the way of economic freedom is how much spending. I mean, there's 5 areas, I know, but the size of government, which is best measured by how much the government spends, right, is one of these areas that drags down economic freedom, right? So you want to avoid that. But there's all these arguments because the political incentives are such that people are constantly trying to justify why we need to have more government spending. Even if you're not a libertarian, the reason to actually try to have less government spending, remember, it means that basically your money that you spend during an emergency is going to go not as far. And even outside of an emergency, high level of debt means lower multiplier. Even if you're someone on the left, you should care about that. Because what you want to be spending money that goes as far as possible. You want a high multiplier. Well, you're not getting a high multiplier no matter what politicians say if you have a lot of debt, right? You want to be able to help the poor if really there's an emergency. right? If there's another pandemic and so many people have to stay home and can't work. I mean, of course, in the US, we send our poor people to work and we kept the computer class comfortably in their homes. And I assume it was the same here. But there's a financial crisis. You want to be able to actually, help lower income people. Well, you do that better if you have less debt. If you have inflation, it's easier. So even if you believe that the government should do a lot of things, you're much better off if you're in a situation that's financially sustainable. And in big part is because no matter how much intellectual power is actually spent to justify the fact that you could spend more and increase the debt, and the fiscal cost is almost zero, as Olivier Blanchard said, right? By the way, these guys, the thing that's significant about those three guys, right? They were the three people on the left who, at the beginning of 2021, were saying, don't spend that last bill, you're going to create inflation. There were a lot of people on the libertarian, and, well, not actually a lot, not enough, but there were a fair amount of people. Those three guys who had spent the last 10 years putting a lot of intellectual power behind showing that increasing spending and increasing the debt could have a fiscal cost of zero, they were the first ones to warn against inflation. And one of the reasons is because they're actually really good Keynesian and they understand a lot of that stuff that I explained. I mean, what I've explained to you, I mean, the way I put it all together, sure, shows my preference for smaller government, right? But the literature I'm using is like it's like academic literature that is totally like, it doesn't have a bias. It's like neoclassical, Keynesian type literature, a lot of, and it's cross-country stuff. So no matter how you feel about government spending and the size of the economy, you're always better off with less debt. And there are always people who are going to tell you that actually we can spend for whatever reason, and you need to keep all these things in mind, right? So now I'll take questions. Okay, so.
I just wanted to make sure that I understood that the problem isn't necessarily high spending, but the problem is just not responsible steps, but they spend more than they get. You can also just raise taxes.
Well, no, the problem is high spending. At a fundamental level, the problem is high spending. Because there's a lot of problem that comes with paying for all that spending with high taxes, right? In terms of creating malinvestment, creating disincentive to work, slowing down the economy, reducing investments, all of that stuff, right? So so there are different problems, but there are problems nonetheless, right? The reason why I focused on debt is because politicians don't like to raise taxes. They just don't. They always talk about on the left about they're going to raise taxes and they want to raise taxes, but the truth of the matter is that for the most part, they never do what they say they want to do, right? There's enough people on their coalition usually that drags their feet to actually really, it doesn't mean that occasionally they can't do things that are really punishing to the rich, right? But one of the things we find also is that when they do really punishing things to the rich, in terms of rate, what they do is they carve the base otherwise, right? It's kind of like they don't want a revolution on their hands, right? I mean, raising taxes, so politicians love to spend money that they think doesn't actually cost them very much politically. And this is why I'm spending so much time on the debt, is because there is a bias in favor of spending that you paid for with borrowed money. Because it looks politically, you're kicking the can down the road, you're putting all of that burden onto future generation. So if you're concerned about voters, really don't care about those future voters, right? So this is why, but I don't want you to think that I think the debt is the biggest problem. At a fundamental level, the real problem is government spending, right? It's spending money that you don't have, either because, and either you pay with it with very high taxes, and then you unleash a lot of problem on your economy, or you do it through debt, and then you have other type of problems.
I know that the interest rate is going up, but didn't the 8% inflation make it any better?
No, so I mean the 8%, it doesn't, what it does is it makes, what inflation is a partial default, right? It means that basically the government has to repay that much less because it erodes the debt, right? So it's a form of partial default. So it's not better. It's just, and in fact, one of the 5 ways that government have traditionally and historically paid down their debt. So there's an IMF study that actually looked at this. There are 5 ways. So you have economic growth, which I don't think, unless there's like an incredible innovation that happens, I don't know whether it's in the cards for us. It's possible, but this is how, it's one of the ways that the US reduces debt to GDP after the Second World War, right? Austerity, which is basically cutting spending and raising taxes, right? By the way, we can talk about this. The only way to really truly reduce the debt to GDP ratio is through cutting spending. The academic literature is actually very clear about this, right? That's the only way where you effectively reduce debt to GDP ratio, so through austerity, cutting spending. A sudden burst of inflation, that's the way to reduce debt. Fiscal oppression, and default, right? So in countries like us, you can assume that the probability of default is relatively low. And so after the Second World War, the US did a mix of lots of government growth, lots of cutting government spending, some inflation and some fiscal repression, but really, I mean, we wouldn't have had that sharp decline in debt in the US if there were not a lot of supply side reform that were put in place, basically a lot of reduction in spending, and basically they took down all the spending from the war, right? And they had inflation, but also they had a massive amount of growth, right? That's really what that got us there. In the 90s, is that the other time where we had a reduction in debt? It was rather small, but that was mostly economic growth because there was in relative term there was some reduction in spending, but not that much. So these are the way to go about it. Does that answer your question? Other questions? Yeah.
How would you respond to the classic argument that says if the government has X amount of money to spend, and if it just so happens to spend X plus 5%, it can, and maybe it does, spend it on stuff that the yield is very positive. For example, building a road, building an airport, or stuff like that. The road will cost, we have to borrow $10 to build the road, but we'll get a yield of $20, so it's worth it.
Well, I mean, so there's a big literature on the multiplier for infrastructure spending. There's a big mystique in everywhere about the power of government spending on infrastructure. When the truth of the matter is like the reality about the high multiplier of spending on infrastructure is when it's done by the private sector. And the reason is because they spend where they know they need the money. More importantly, a lot of the work shows that governments, that spending on infrastructure is like a supporting actor. So if you go, like a lot of governments do, and spend infrastructure money in the hope that you're going to create economic growth, this is going to fail. On the other hand, if you have a booming economy, right? Let's say suddenly you have a local economy that becomes a hub for some tech, innovation, whatever, blah, 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 right? Suddenly, so you have growth there. Whatever investment you do to support the infrastructure, to support that growth, that has a very high multiplier. But I don't know if you've seen the movie with Kevin Costner, Build It, They Will Come, right? It's not like this with the infrastructure spending. I know there's a mystique about it, but it's just not true. If you build it, it won't come. If they're here, yes, build it, and that will, so I just kind of, and it's kind of really, one of the things that fascinates me about economists and about government officials is that there's a lot of literature about a lot of things, right? And for instance, during the austerity debate that we had in the US in 2011, right, about what are the best ways to reduce government spending, to reduce debt to GDP level, right? It was like I went and looked at all of this at the time because there was the big talk of the time. President Obama was talking about we were going to do the balanced approach, which is $1 in spending cut for $1 of tax increase, blah, 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 right? So I went, and as it turned out, there was a lot of literature. A lot of it was led by an economist who died, unfortunately, not too long ago, called Alberto Alesina, who was at Harvard. But he wasn't the only one. The IMF had some literature that showed exactly the same thing, that the best way, the best form of fiscal adjustment that you could put in place to reduce debt to GDP ratio is packages that are mostly made of government spending cuts. There are studies that actually show what kind of spending cuts are the most effective to achieve that goal. In the context of the US, is social transfers. That's the 3 programs I told you about, right? What we call wrongly entitlement spending. It's mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, right? That's the best way. The next question that was, and even the IMF, right, which at the time was led by Olivier Blanchard, their own research showed that, right? The other big question was, if you put in place these type of packages, the one that are made mostly of spending cuts versus the one that are made mostly of tax increases, what is the impact on long-term and short-term growth, right? Super important question. Long-term, no question. If you do this by increasing taxes, you slow down long-term growth, right? If you do it with spending cuts, you increase long-term growth, right? Now, what about the short term? Well, the short term is you will very likely get a slowdown. So with taxes, you get slowdown, and it lasts for a long time. With packages that are made of spending cuts, you mostly will get a slowdown, but it will be short-lived and it will be really small. We know this thing. The IMF literature confirmed that. And yet Olivier Blanchard and the IMF economists were saying things that their own literature wasn't saying. They said, oh, we should go with a balanced approach. I don't get it. We have a lot of literature on infrastructure spending. We have a lot of literature that shows that the multiplier, if you really want to actually get big return for the spending you spend, for the spending that you spend, it's better to do it let the private sector do it, right? And yet they continue asserting that the infrastructure multiplier for government is 1.5. It's never 1.5. And so I'm baffled, right? You were asking, how do we convince people? I don't know. I don't know how we convince people, because when the political moment comes, they actually ignore their own research, Christina Romer, who was the head of the Council of Economic Advisor under Obama, she's a very respected, more left-wing economist, but she showed, right, that the tax multiplier, so taxing your way through a recovery, was creating more damage to the economy. But when she was the economist for Obama, suddenly she forgot all of her own research. So I'm at loss, I have to say, because there's so much literature out there, right? And I don't know how to get to people. I don't know. I'm hoping, I'm very hopeful that as painful as it is, this inflation is going to do a lot of talking for me. Yeah.
So, Vero, I think part of this also requires some discussion along the lines of what Bob was talking about this morning. This tension between what we call economic freedom and political freedom. And economic freedom and so-called democracy. Because we have an issue called law and property rights. And basically what's happened is we have a disconnect between these two things. And that is democracy allows you to vote and take people's stuff. Whereas we could have a compelling discussion here, go around the room and say, okay, do we think that some students here are poorer than other students here? And is that okay? And then we can come up to a conclusion and say, no, it's not okay. We should equalize things. And then just take a vote and say, okay, we've got 30 students. So if we can get 16 students to decide that we should take money from everybody and transfer to other people, that's okay. And if you think that's okay, then this just goes on. And as long as you have compelling politicians to convince people that you should do that, this is always going to happen. So really, the only solution is you run a country by law, and you don't run a country by a popular vote. So it may not be a popular thing to say, but it's reality. And as long as you don't have law, you're always going to have this. So when you have a situation where you might have a politician who believes it and is a good salesperson, like for instance like Reagan or Thatcher or whatever, right, in the right situation, they might be able to get votes and get elected and convince people to not do it. But most of the time, as I think George Bernard Shaw said, that if you argue to take money from Peter and give it to Paul, Paul is always going to think that's a good idea. And if you've got enough votes to do it, you can do it. So the core is an issue of how a society recognizes law.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with you.
You're going to disagree with me.
No, I said I don't disagree with you. I do have kind of I'm always wondering who enforces the law. Again, as I said, right? I mean, we have a lot of rules in the U.S. that are just violated absolutely constantly, and you better be sure that the laws are correct. But otherwise, I totally agree with you. And this is why I'm so concerned with actually erosion of things like the fiscal norms, right? It used to be that, I don't know if it's the case, and there used to be at least that's what I was told, that in the US, farmers couldn't stand to go into debt, right? Just like they hated debt, it was too much risk, it was too much, and now apparently all these norms have actually eroded, and so there's just ultimately, maybe what it does is it gets down to kind of culture and our tolerance for thinking it's okay to expropriate some to give to others, and at what level, right? Like for instance, like in France, I can't say that. I mean, I don't know for Israel, and I know that a lot of like there's not a lot of private charity in France, and one of the reasons there's not a lot of private charity and volunteering and donation is because the government has stepped in a long time ago to say, I'm going to take care of the poor, I'm going to take care of the art, I'm going to take care of all of that stuff, right? So French people are like, well, I don't need to do it. I don't need to care for poor people. I don't need to volunteer at church. Or I don't need to volunteer in my community. I don't need to do this or that, right? Because the government does it. In the US, I mean, the tradition of giving, the tradition of volunteering, the tradition of helping others is just much more potent, but it's deteriorating too, right? And so, I mean, maybe it just boils down to culture. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. This is like above my pay grade. But I am I'm banging my head against the wall because in my job, in part at least the way I do it is because I'm hoping to get us to a world that I like better because I believe it'd be a better world for everyone. But I'm not, I mean, I work, the number of time in a year where I'm telling myself, well, at least, you know, I get paid for what I do. At the very least, I put food on the table thanks to what I do. But what I would really want to do is actually something that actually really changes things. I mean, that's what I'd like to do. And I can't say that I feel extremely successful most of the time. I've had small victories, right? But, yeah.
I want to ask about policies related to climate change.
Yeah.
So we know for certain that the climate is warming and it might have a very bad result in the future, in our future generation. So the question is when we will start adding carbon into the atmosphere and when it will happen sometime, we don't know when and we don't know what exactly the consequences will be, how hard this will be. So we think that in certain cases, not in the US maybe, but in certain cases it is actually rational to take roles that the future generation will take to avoid this climate change that is when it's done, you can't change that.
Actually, so my answer is no. I'll tell you why. So first, there are two things you've said that I think needs to be proven. The first one is that we know for sure that is going to be really bad. Actually, contrary, we know the climate is warming. That is an established fact, right? There's actually a lot of claim about where this is going where there's actually contrary, at least in the US, to the talking points of the media, absolutely are not representing the scientific consensus.
So the IPCC is not representing?
Well, but so they're, a lot of what they're saying, right? I mean, if you actually look at what they're saying, the truth of the matter is that there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of variability, but I mean, let's even assume, right? We know that it's bad. I mean, I'm not even willing to debate this, but in the US, there are people who've been saying for 4 years that in 12 years we'll be dead. Literally, people who are in power right now are saying, Greta, the Swedish protege, whatever, I mean, she says stuff that are nonsense, that are non-proven, right?
Scientists do agree that in a lot of certainty it will not be good.
Oh, but then not be good, I'm willing to concede that, but what that means, right, is still a question for debate. This notion of this catastrophe, I think actually remains to be proven, right? And everything we hear I'm not saying, again, I am not saying it's good. Not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that there's a lot of alarmism that takes place in the political scene and in the climate advocacy that is not as factual as people think. The other claim that you made is that government is the player, is the actor that actually can solve this problem. Unfortunately, very often I just actually don't believe. I believe that the problem we have with climate, which is real, is going to be addressed through innovation, is going to be addressed through private companies. Unfortunately, a lot of the government action, I mean, if you look at the thing is that governments they make these accords and they say, we need to do this, we need to do that, right? But none of them actually live by those rules. And the truth of the matter is that if they were consistent with what they actually claim is going to happen and what needs to happen, they would shut down the economy now. None of them is willing to do this. So it's always kind of, there's just a lot of talking around the other thing that I know is like a lot of the government spending that takes place in the name of climate, a lot of the stuff it does is actually basically gives incentive for a lot of investment to go in a particular place and hinders all other innovation, right? There's a lot of cronyism. There's a lot of cronyism that is happening, right? Like investing in solar panels that are actually, not necessarily working, and it's hindering the problem. It's actually hindering overall innovation, right? The other thing is like the Build Back Better, a big part of it was the climate investments, right? What did that bill do? It was actually it was imposing a lot of tax on capital. What tax on capital do? They actually create disincentive for capital to be invested, right? So in the end, you get some government investment in something that may or may not work, and you're creating massive reduction of wealth and of investment from the private sector. All of these things are counterproductive, in my opinion. I have much more faith. I'm saying it's partially faith, partially based on what we know of the past, that actually the solution to climate will come from the private sector, more likely than by any government intervention that they could put in place. And so I think we have to be careful, right? I take actually global warming seriously. I don't take those clowns who are meeting at big conference to talk about how serious they are about climate and how they're going to clamp down on some form of investors and throw money at others. I don't trust them to address the climate. I have a lot of faith. I have friends who actually follow the innovation in the climate industry, and apparently they're like totally amazing stuff that is happening. Things that are like completely financed by the private sector, right? The government would go nowhere near. It's like crazy stuff like taking stones, particular stone that are painted a particular color and putting them at the bottom of the ocean, as opposed to growing forests, which if they burn, then, they're crazy stuff, right? I have more faith in this, if only because of our past, but also part of it is faith, right? Right? And I also know that people, consumers, the best motivator for first, economic growth reduces pollution a lot of the time. Communist countries are Bob, I don't know if any of your stuff measures this, but there's massive pollutions, the crappier the economic growth because they have crappy cars. It's look, the automobile industry has been improving for decades. Not only the quality of its engine to go faster, but also for pollution. And a big part of this is because consumers want to live in a world that's more green, right? That, in my opinion, is a more powerful driver for finding a solution than our political leaders. But so you have to be careful, right? Like, because there's a lot of assumption, or there were a lot of claims that I don't think are causal as you made them to be. And I can't blame you. This is what we hear all the time.
I think that in Israel, for example, there is certain stuff that it won't change. The government is controlling. For example, we have big coal power plants, and it's a monopoly of the government. So unless there will be, the government is the one that can do something about it, or else it can probably.
But look.
Also, there is a network, for example.
But look,
only the government can.
Even the oil company is spending a ton of money to be more environmentally friendly. The other thing that oil companies are doing, they're investing a massive amount of money on green innovations, right? Why? Because they know that's what consumers want, right? The other thing is like...
Because they know that's what politicians want.
Well, there's some of that for sure, but I think they also know, and also you assume that like people who work in the oil industry doesn't care about the environment. I mean, I'm not even getting into the whether that's what's creating all the pollution. I have no idea. That I don't know, right? I'm letting scientific leaders talk about this. But the other thing is, like, think about what has been happening. France, so nuclear energy, not profitable, but much more friendly to the environment, right? Look at those bozos in France, which have started closing their nuclear plants because suddenly, the environmental, like now it's just solar panel, and now they're like kind of back, and Germany, right? I mean, so you can't trust these people, right? If you remember one thing from this talk, one, right? Just one. Please, when you're presented with a problem and someone say, well, what can the government do? Please pause for a second and ask yourself if the government is the best group of people to address it. In some cases, I mean, it could be that the answer is yes, right? But the government isn't the solution to everything. And unfortunately, in the way we talk about our problems, the first instinct is always to say, what can the government do? What can the government do? If you remember one thing, is this. Each time you hear what can the government do, think, well, what can the private sector do first? Or maybe, what does the government need to get it out of the way for the private sector to be able to do its thing, right? These are instincts that if we could all control these instincts, I think we would have a much better public discourse. And we would hold politicians and special interest groups who have an interest in selling you the idea that the government is always a solution, we could hold their feet to the fire.